I'll be going over the view of psychology known as structuralism. So structuralism was founded by a man named Edward Bradford Titchener, and Titchener held the minority position that psychology should be considered the study of mind, or what's termed phenomenal consciousness, the first-person experience of things like sensations, feelings, and emotions. As such, structuralism was a framework aimed at supporting this investigation, and it sought to determine the fundamental building blocks or units of consciousness. These fundamental units could be simple experiences like the blueness of blue or the warmth of a tactile sensation, irreducible elements that, when combined, were thought to compose the entirety of conscious experience. If you imagine consciousness as like the screen of a computer, then structuralism's goal would be to identify and understand the RGB pixels used to construct images on that screen. In order to really understand the intricacies of structuralism, I'll give an overview of Titchener's philosophy of psychology, starting with his views of scientific endeavor in general. So Titchener was an empiricist, and that essentially means that he saw all knowledge as being derived from experience. So we learn about ourselves through experiencing ourselves, our emotions, our thoughts, and our memories, and we learn about the external world through sensory experience, touch, taste, sound, sight, vision, and smell. I think I said vision a few times. There are synonyms of it, but you get the idea. And in the first chapter of his book, A Textbook of Psychology, Titchener takes this empiricist lens and he runs with it, first asking us to consider a thought experiment. So imagine we look at a particular experience from two very different perspectives. In the first perspective, we look at an experience divorced from the experiencer. So for example, we consider what it's like to witness a car crash, and we remove ourselves from that experience. This means we don't consider our emotional reactions to the crash, our fear, our heart rate, etc. Instead, we extract and solely analyze the sensory experiences we had about the crash itself, what it looked like and what it sounded like. We'll call this the abstracted view of experience because we've abstracted out the experiencer. We can also take a second perspective on the experience of witnessing a car accident and fully consider the experiencer. So we would include in our analysis our personal emotions, fears, and physiological sensations upon seeing the crash. We'll call this view the unabstracted view since we have not abstracted ourselves out of it. Keep these two perspectives, the abstracted and the unabstracted views, in the back of your head for now because they'll come up again shortly. So after establishing the two views, Titchener invites us to consider the nature of physics. Titchener points out that the foundational elements of physics, at least for his time, space, time, and mass, are constant in all places. Wherever and whenever you measure it, 1 centimeter is always the same, as is 1 second, as is 1 grain. These elements, viewed through the lens of physics, are independent of human beings. In other words, they're not just constant in all times and places, but they're constant also whether or not we're around to measure them in the first place. Since, as we discussed, Titchener is an empiricist, he sees all knowledge about the outside world as coming solely from experience with the world. Thus, our knowledge of centimeters, seconds, and grains comes from looking at our experiences in a certain knowledge-gathering mode. We have to interpret our experiences in order to learn from them and make deductions about what the world is like. And he identifies this knowledge-gathering mode as the abstracted view from earlier, in which the experiencer is not considered. In other words, to transmute our experiences of the world into knowledge about the world, we must think of our experiences as, in some sense, independent of ourselves, not facts about us and what we went through, but facts about the world. So Titchener sees physics as the abstracted view of human experience, and attributes the constancy and observer independence of physics to abstracting out the experiencer from that experience. And to bolster his point further, Titchener then goes on to note that our personal experiences of all of physics' fundamental elements are subject to inconsistencies. So 1 hour feels very short at a concert, but quite long at the dentist. And a box of greater density will actually feel heavier than a less dense box, even if they actually have the same mass. Also, distances of the same length can appear inequivalent in rather rudimentary illusions, such as the one depicted on this slide, and I'm sure you guys have seen this before. What we have here is time, space, and mass being inconsistent in the way that we experience them. And you might notice that all of these inconsistencies are the subject of psychological investigation, and we can only really consider them if we take the unabstracted view and consider the experiences from the perspective of the experiencer. In other words, once we take the unabstracted view, we lose the constancy of physics and enter the realm of psychology. Titchener concludes from all of this that the hard sciences and psychology actually study the same thing, just from two perspectives. Physics studies human experience with the experiencer abstracted out, and psychology studies human experience without such an abstraction. And this is Titchener's insight. Both physics and psychology are simply different lenses on the same experiential stream. So now that we understand Titchener's view of the sciences, let's consider his perspective on the mind-body problem, or how it is that subjective conscious experience can arise from physical matter, and in what manner does the physical matter of the brain and the nervous system interact with the subjective conscious experiences that we feel. Titchener begins his dissection of the mind-body problem by first identifying what he terms the common sense view. The common sense view, as Titchener sees it, is that mental states cause physical states and vice versa. So, for example, someone who holds the common sense view might say something like, sadness causes us to cry, or stubbing my toe causes me to feel pain. The key point is that there exists a causal relationship between mind and body. The mind can cause changes in the body, and the body can cause changes in the mind. Now, Titchener actually rejects this common-sense causal view of the mind-body problem. Instead, Titchener argues that there is no causal relationship between the mind and the body, and he uses the same reasoning he established when he spoke on the distinction between psychology and physics. So, Titchener says that, just as physics and psychology study the same thing, just from two different perspectives, the mind and the body are the same thing, just from two different perspectives. And this kind of makes sense if you think about it, at least from his perspective. So the body is a biological organism, and biology is simply a form of chemistry, and all of chemistry is just a form of physics. So the body is the subject of physics, or the abstracted view. To Titchener, the mind is just the unabstracted body, or maybe the unabstracted brain and nervous system, which are just parts of the body. So again, to Titchener, the mind and the body are the same thing, viewed from different perspectives. Because of this, Titchener sees it as making no sense to say the body causes the mind in much the same way that you can't say the head of a coin causes the tail. They're the same object viewed from different perspectives. And so the causal language that we use when we discuss the mind-body problem, when we ask which causes which or how do they cause each other, is just inappropriate because it treats what is dual merely in appearance as also dual in substance. Instead, Titchener sees the mind and the body running in parallel, in perfect synchrony, never contradicting each other. And this non-contradiction is not out of happenstance, but rather it arises from the mind and the body literally being, in some sense, the same entity. And this is the view known as psychophysical parallelism. And because Titchener holds this view, he thinks that psychology should not be in the business of making causal claims about how the body makes us feel one way or the other, but only claims about which physiological processes correlate with different mental states. Okay, so we need to tackle one final set of philosophical issues before we can see how structuralism comes together, and these issues have to do with the difficulty of creating a science of consciousness, and for several reasons this is not an easy task. So the Greek philosopher Heraclitus once said that a man cannot step into the same river twice, because it is not the same river, and he is not the same man. While Heraclitus was not speaking about consciousness when he said this, the quote still kind of beautifully reflects some critiques that have been levied at the idea of studying consciousness in a scientific manner. One of the most powerful of these critiques is that, unlike a rock or a tree, which are both relatively static and unchanging and the subject of geology and biology respectively, studying consciousness is quite a challenge because it is constantly in flux. At every moment, it has changed from the preceding moment, and there seems to be no safe reason to assume one moment of consciousness is anything like another. Consciousness is a stream, and just as Heraclitus pointed out, you can never stand in the same stream twice. Just as you can't know if your friend's experience of the color red is the same as your own, you can't really even be sure your past experience of the color red is the same as your current one. So how can we possibly study something that changes drastically every time we attempt to analyze it? Furthermore, even if we ignore this issue, consciousness is never filled with only one isolated experience, but many concurrent experiences that muddy the waters of our stream even further. This muddying of the waters makes the structuralist goal of identifying the fundamental components of consciousness quite difficult. Now, Titchener argued that psychology could surmount these challenges, and his primary optimism for this follows from these reasons. So first, Titchener concedes that while psychology seeks to understand the overarching nature of consciousness, psychology can only investigate little moments of consciousness, or slivers of the stream. However, this shouldn't lead us to despair about the endeavor of psychology in general. A stream can show regularities in its behavior. So for example, like perturbations on its surface have like causes. And so even though we can only study little fragments of a stream, we can still develop a science of streams. And just as we assume a stream behaves in a predictable manner, and similar waves in the stream will have similar physical causes, so too can we assume that mental processes will group themselves in an orderly manner, and similar circumstances or environments or stimuli will bring up within a person similar mental states. Thus, consciousness can be studied scientifically. We start with the instantaneous moments and then, using these data, discover the laws of mental life. So what have we established so far? Psychology and physics study the same thing. Likewise, the mind and the body are the same entity. And finally, the scientific study of consciousness is an endeavor not doomed to failure, and so we should be optimistic about its potential. Now, the last question is how we should go about developing this science. What methods should we use, and what should be our plan of attack? So first we have to ask ourselves, what makes a science a science? According to Titchener, you get a science the moment you have a systematized series of recorded observations. Ideally, these observations are repeatable, so you can make the same or similar observations an arbitrary number of times. They're isolatable, meaning the object of study across observations isn't severely occluded by extraneous phenomena. And finally, observations should be variable. That is, you can repeat an observation while changing different conditions to see how the observation changes in turn. Titchener notes that all scientific instruments are designed with these three purposes in mind, and the better the instrument, the better it accomplishes these three tasks. To take an example, a microscope allows for arbitrarily repeatable observation. You can look through the eyepiece as often as you wish. It also allows for isolation. The slide, if prepared well, presents only the specimen of interest, minimizing interference of irrelevant material. Lastly, the microscope allows for variation. You can manipulate variables such as magnification, lighting, staining techniques, or even the specimen itself to observe how different conditions affect what is seen. The instrument of psychology, Titchener argues, is that of introspection, or direct observation of one's own mental states. And this is the only instrument we can really use, because it's only through introspection that we have access to our consciousness's contents. So how does introspection stack up against the three aims of scientific instrumentation? Well, it's certainly repeatable. We can introspect upon similar conscious states by introspecting when presented with repeated stimuli and environments. Introspection is also variable. We can modify aspects of stimuli and the environment upon introspection and then observe how our introspective mental states change. We have, however, a significant difficulty with introspection, which is that it's not very apt at isolating mental phenomena due to what we could term the contamination problem. The contamination problem is essentially the issue that introspection, by its very nature, must disturb what it observes. This is because introspection is a conscious process, and so to use introspection, we must use our consciousness to study what's in our consciousness. So it's kind of like this image of a camera viewing its own feed. Whatever was in its feed before it turned to look at itself is now out of the picture, and Titchener argues that something similar occurs with introspection. Titchener's solution is to utilize retrospection, so the introspection of our memories. And this circumvents the contamination problem. The issue with introspection is that it interferes with the present contents of consciousness. Retrospection, however, can't interfere with the past contents of consciousness, because remembering something can't change what happened in the past. And so Titchener then proposes two refinements we can make to the retrospective process to make it even more suited for a science of consciousness. The first of these is to cue retrospection at different times within a single experience, across multiple trials. You don't want to cue for retrospection multiple times during the same trial, because then you run into the issue that past retrospections within that trial may have interfered with the cohesive experience of the whole. This multiple trial method allows us to paint a more comprehensive picture of our internal states as they relate to some environmental circumstance or set of circumstances. Titchener's second refinement of the retrospective process is to train participants such that they are better able to give accurate and precise accounts of their experience, and Titchener argues that this skill doesn't always come naturally. So when we communicate our experiences to others, we often use words that don't fully capture our exact internal states because these precise accounts are often irrelevant in conversation. For example, if someone were to ask you, "What are you thinking about right now?" you might say, "Oh, I was thinking about Jacob's jacket." However, upon further inspection, you might realize that what you were really thinking about was something much more specific, like the blueness of the left sleeve of Jacob's jacket. And you may not even have perceived the jacket as Jacob's jacket in that moment, but just a jacket in general. To avoid participants being misled in this way, Titchener saw it as very important that they're thoroughly trained out of these habits. We're now at a point where we can condense Titchener's philosophies into a single, coherent, and unified vision or mission for psychology. So first and foremost, Titchener says that the psychological endeavor should be one of utilizing many trained participants to isolate the irreducible and universal aspects of human experience, the smallest building blocks or pixels of everything we think and feel. After we build a taxonomy of these fundamental components, psychology should seek to determine the regularities that underpin how those components interact with each other, when they tend to co-occur, when they dissipate, and when they show up again. In essence, psychology should try to discover the laws of these components, the laws of mental life. Lastly, once we've developed a taxonomy of human experience and the laws that govern them, we should investigate what physiological processes correlate but don't cause those experiences. Remember, Titchener has the view that physiological processes don't cause mental states or vice versa. So in summary, on Titchener's view, structuralism, psychology should 1. Reduce human experience to its fundamental components through introspection, 2. Generalize consistencies in how these fundamental components interact, arise, and dissipate, and 3. Correlate these generalizations and fundamental components with physiological phenomena. For Titchener, once this process has been completed for all human experience, the psychological endeavor has been completed, and that's structuralism.